It's a strange thing, isn't it? To be in a room full of people who are supposed to know you best and feel completely invisible. I thought I understood the difference between family and business, but I never expected the two to clash so violently. My story isn't about the millions of dollars or the land I lost. It's about a single, gut-wrenching moment when I realized that the people closest to me didn't see me at all, that they traded my true value for their own assumptions. All it took was a cold piece of paper on my coffee table and a family meeting that changed everything. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Elizabeth Miller, and I never expected a piece of paper to feel like a punch in the stomach. At 45, I thought I had a firm grasp on my own worth. A quiet confidence built from years of designing spaces that breathed life into forgotten corners of the city. But on that damp, late autumn afternoon, with Chicago's gray light filtering through the windows of my penthouse, a single line on a legal document sent my world tilting. It wasn't about the millions of dollars or the vast acreage of land. It was about the cold. Formal confirmation that my family had formally revoked my inheritance. The land my mother had willed to me, her only child. The one thing I had always believed was my birthright. The paper lay on my polished glass coffee table, a stark, white scar against the organized tranquility of my life. A cruel reminder of how easily the legacy of blood can be undone by the judgment of those who share it. The memory of the last family meeting still had a chilling echo in the silent, empty spaces of my penthouse. We had all gathered at the Grand Miller estate, a place filled with ancestral portraits and the scent of old money. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, the leather worn smooth from generations of my family making momentous decisions within its walls. That day, my grandmother, Eleanor, a woman with a will as unyielding as her perfectly coiffed silver hair, had looked at me with an expression of polite pity. She had leaned forward, her voice a low, decisive rumble. Liz is merely an amateur artist. She has no business managing the extensive Miller holdings. The estate is a legacy, not a playground. Her gaze had then shifted to my younger brother, David, who sat across from me, his face carefully composed into a look of quiet, humble acceptance. She'd continued, "It should and will belong to David." The words had not been a question or a discussion. They had been a verdict, a final, unappealable sentence delivered with the casual authority of a matriarch who knew her word was law. My Aunt Sarah, who had always viewed me as a flighty oddity, a creator of useless beauty, had worn a small, triumphant smirk that she believed no one could see, a thin, cruel line of a smile that told me everything I needed to know about her role in this orchestrated ambush. David had offered no protest, no defense, only a small nod of agreement that felt more like a betrayal than his silence. I had sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, feeling the chill of the air-conditioned room seep into my bones, a physical manifestation of the coldness of their words. It wasn't just about the land. It was about the deep-seated lack of respect, the casual dismissal of my entire professional life. I looked down at the silver compass ring on my finger, the one my mother had left me, her last gift, which she had told me would always point me toward my true worth. Now it felt like a heavy, useless thing, a broken promise. The last time I saw my mother, it was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in her garden. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and her favorite lilacs. We walked the winding stone path as the sun, warm and generous, kissed the tops of the trees. She wasn't frail, but there was a quiet knowing in her eyes, a look that told me she knew she was nearing the end of her journey. She paused, took my hand, and pressed the compass ring into my palm. "They will try to give you everything, Elizabeth," she had said, her voice a soft, knowing rustle, "and they will try to take everything away. Don't let them define you by what you own or what they give you. Your worth isn't in their balance sheets. It's in the lines you draw, the spaces you create. This ring will always point you to your own North Star, away from what they can buy, and toward what you can truly build. It was more than an heirloom. It was a final, sacred pact between us. It was a beacon that I had trusted. But now, in the face of their betrayal, its light seemed to flicker and fade. I remember another moment, years ago, when the pressure of my family's expectations was just beginning to settle on us like a heavy blanket. David and I were teenagers, sitting on the porch swing at the estate, the cicadas buzzing a steady chorus in the evening heat. He was sketching houses in a notebook, precise and perfect, and I was just doodling, letting my pen wander across the page. He glanced at my sketchbook and his eyes widened. "Liz," he said, his voice low and a little awestruck, "your drawings. They're not just buildings. They have a soul." He looked at me, a flicker of something close to envy in his eyes. "Grandma Eleanor told me my job is to manage the empire, not to create it. She said my purpose is to protect the legacy, not to build a new one." He sighed, a heavy, tired sound even then. "I'm good at what she wants me to be good at, but you're good at something they can't even see. Don't ever let them take that away from you." That moment of shared vulnerability had been a secret between us, a fragile bond that seemed to have been forgotten under the weight of his chosen path. The disinheritance was the culmination of a decade of small, almost imperceptible acts of disregard. It began with the little things: my invitations to family dinners would be delivered last, a subtle hint that I was not a priority. When my designs won awards, my brother or aunt would offer a backhanded compliment. Something like, "That's lovely. Dear, it must be so nice to have a creative hobby." My work, my passion, my profession, the very thing that defined me, was treated as a whimsical pastime, a fleeting interest that would eventually be replaced by something more substantial, more Miller. My mother had been the only one who saw me, who truly understood my vision. That compass ring was not just an heirloom. It was a physical testament to her faith in me, a silent pact between us that my true value would never be measured by their metrics. It was a beacon that I had trusted, but now, in the face of their betrayal, its light seemed to flicker and fade. So I stopped fighting. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I didn't even bother to respond to their endless stream of condescending texts and emails. I simply went silent. The penthouse, the expensive furniture, the high-end car, they all felt like gilded cages. The city I loved, with its towering spires and relentless energy, seemed to mock my gilded existence. I sold the car, moved out of the penthouse, and found myself a small, unpretentious studio in a quiet downtown neighborhood, a space with high ceilings and endless possibilities, a place where I could breathe again. The walls were bare, the floors were concrete, and the only luxury was the uninterrupted time I had to work. I spent my days and nights hunched over my drawing board, lost in the intricate details of a new project that had captivated my imagination, the kind of project my family would have scoffed at. It was the transformation of a forgotten, industrial waterfront into a community arts center, a place of light and color that would offer new life to a tired part of the city. I was no longer Elizabeth Miller, heiress to nothing. I was just Liz, the architect, and it was a name that felt more real than any title I had ever held. The journey was not easy. While my family was busy assuming I had fallen off the face of the earth, my Aunt Sarah was still hard at work in the shadows, her malice as subtle as it was sharp. I discovered through a friend that Sarah had been discreetly meeting with a major corporate client I had been courting for months. She told them I was too unreliable, too creative for a project that required a serious long-term vision. My friend relayed, her voice laced with an uncomfortable pity, said I preferred passion projects over profits, as if it were a fatal flaw. The message was clear: my aunt wasn't just content to see me fail. She was actively working to ensure it. The news hit me like a cold wave, but it also hardened my resolve. I wouldn't let her define me. Instead, I delved deeper into the Inspiration Project. I spent my days in the old harborfront warehouses, the air thick with the scent of salt and rust. I wasn't just drawing blueprints, I was listening. I talked to the young graffiti artists whose work decorated the crumbling walls, the retired dock workers who remembered the harbor's glory days, and the single mothers who dreamed of a safe, beautiful space for their children. One afternoon, a young artist named Leo, whose mural of a soaring phoenix was the centerpiece of a derelict building, looked at my sketches and said, "You're not just designing a building, you're designing hope." His words were a mirror, showing me the purpose of my work far beyond the money or recognition. The project was for them, for the community, a living testament to the belief that beauty and purpose could rise from forgotten places. As the months passed, my quiet life continued, but my family's world began to show cracks. I saw a headline in the business section: Miller Holdings hit with legal setback. David Miller's latest project stalls. The article detailed a series of unexpected structural flaws and zoning disputes, followed by a public outcry from community members who felt his luxury condo project was soulless and disrespectful to the area's history. It was a failure of vision, a failure of understanding. The land they had so proudly fought for was now a symbol of their short-sightedness. It was a stark contrast to my own project, which was now attracting silent, but powerful, attention from a different kind of investor, one who valued legacy over profit. A few days before the Miller family's annual charity gala, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. "Elizabeth? It's your Aunt Sarah." Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone I hadn't heard in years. "I know this is sudden, darling, but I was just calling to check in. I heard you've been busy." I said nothing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I was just thinking," she continued, her voice dropping a notch, "that you might want to skip the gala this year. It's going to be a very high-profile event. There will be important people there. We wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable. It's just a thought. Of course, we're a family, after all." The thinly veiled threat was clear: stay away, or be publicly humiliated. Her concern was a final, desperate attempt to maintain control. I simply replied, "Thank you for your concern. Aunt Sarah, I'll consider it," and hung up, a cold, hard resolve settling in my stomach. Her call had done the opposite of what she intended. I was not just going to the gala, I was going to stand in my truth. So I arrived at the Grand Miller estate, dressed in a simple, understated black dress that made me feel like a shadow among the glittering diamonds and silk. I watched from a distance as Grandmother Eleanor and David held court in the main hall, their laughter ringing with the self-satisfaction of those who believe they have won. Their conversation was a loud and public celebration of their newest real estate acquisitions, punctuated by the clinking of champagne flutes and the sycophantic laughter of their associates. I kept my distance, content to be a silent observer. I saw them talking to a powerful group of investors, men and women in sharp suits, and I heard them proudly discussing David's latest real estate projects, their voices loud enough to carry across the room. My heart was a quiet, unfeeling thing in my chest, a small, still point in the swirling chaos of the gala. Then I heard it: a prominent investor, a man whose word could make or break a career, a man I knew by reputation. Ask David. "Do you know who the architect is behind that inspiration project downtown? She's an absolute genius. The whole city is buzzing about it." David's face, so confident just a moment before, faltered. He mumbled something about not being familiar with the project, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The room seemed to fall silent around me. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, a mixture of disbelief and a strange, quiet triumph. I watched as the investor, a man named George Harrison, turned away from David and his group, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone. Then, his gaze landed on me. He walked directly toward me, his steps slow and deliberate, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He stopped directly in front of me, his voice a low, steady rumble, audible only to a few people nearby. "You're not David Miller, are you?" he asked, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "You're Elizabeth Miller, the only architect I know who would turn down a multi-million-dollar corporate offer to pursue a passion project, a project your late mother fought to protect. And I must say," he added, his voice rising just enough to be heard by the stunned group of my family members, "you were absolutely right to do it. The project is a work of art, and it's going to change the face of this city." I didn't say a word. I simply watched as the room shifted, as the eyes that had previously ignored me now stared with a mixture of confusion and shock. Grandmother Eleanor's face, a mask of unyielding control just moments before, now crumpled in confusion. Aunt Sarah's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered horror. My brother David looked as though he had just been caught in a lie, his face pale, his hands nervously clenching and unclenching at his sides. The investors who had been congratulating him now turned their attention to me, their voices filled with a new respectful curiosity. "I've been following your work for years," one said, "but I never knew it was you." Another added, "Your mother, she was a true visionary. It's clear you've inherited her spirit." The land they had so proudly stripped from me was eventually sold to a foundation, a detail I learned later, but one that no longer held any significance for me. I received a formal letter from the family's lawyers, stating that due to new information and unforeseen circumstances, the inheritance was being reconsidered. I threw the letter in the trash without a second thought. My brother, David, found me standing by the empty punch bowl, his face a mixture of shame and disbelief. "You were right, Liz," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "We were so wrong about you." I simply nodded. Offering no apology, no explanation, there was nothing left to say. I had claimed my legacy, not with a piece of paper or a fight for property, but with my own two hands, with a quiet strength that had built something real out of nothing. I didn't need their approval anymore. My value wasn't in the assets I owned or the title I held, but in what I had built, in what I had given back to the world. I learned that my value wasn't in their validation, but in my own quiet integrity. I didn't need to go back, to forgive, or to explain, because the truth was now an unshakable part of me, and a memory they could never erase. As I turned to leave, a hand gently touched my arm. It was Evelyn, an old friend of my mother's. Her eyes, warm and kind, held a knowing light. "Your mother always knew this would happen," she said softly, her voice a balm to my raw emotions. "She was never fighting for you to get the land. She was fighting for them to see what you could do on your own, without it. She knew they would dismiss you, and she knew you would be the one to prove them all wrong." Evelyn leaned in closer, a conspiratorial whisper in my ear. "She even arranged for her old friend, the editor of that magazine, to keep an eye on your work, to make sure you got the exposure you deserved when the time was right. This wasn't a fluke, Elizabeth. It was her final, perfect plan. She was setting you free." I walked away from the gala, not running, but walking with a purposeful stride. The cool night air felt refreshing on my skin. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see George Harrison, the investor, catching up. "Miss Miller, a moment, if you please," he said, his voice now devoid of the performance it had held in the ballroom. "I'm not here to talk business. I'm here to tell you that I've been a friend of your mother's for decades. She was a woman of immense vision, and she told me about her secret protege. She asked me to keep an eye out for a project that would make the world take notice. When I saw the plans for your arts center, I knew it was you." He handed me a simple business card, not for a Miller Holdings subsidiary, but for his private foundation. "I have a fund dedicated to preserving historical landmarks and supporting community-focused projects. Your work is exactly what we're looking for. This isn't just an offer, it's a partnership. A chance to build more than buildings, to build a true legacy." I looked at the card in my hand, a small, unassuming piece of paper that held more value than the entire Miller estate. I finally understood. My mother's legacy wasn't the land, it was the ability to recognize true worth, in myself and in others, and she had given that gift to me. I simply turned and walked away, a ghost who had finally, truly, found her home.